Hello, scholars. Mr. Long here, signing on. Today for U.S. and Virginia history, we're going to be taking a look at the politics of the American Civil War, some of the behind-the-scenes stuff taking place at the same time as all the exciting battles that we've been talking about around these politics. Here's our agenda. We're going to review a little bit about the events leading up to the American Civil War, and then we're going to talk about the Trent Affair, the Emancipation Proclamation, Habeas Corpus, Conscription, and the draft riots. So it should be a pretty quick video today. A little bit of a review of what we've been talking about in the days leading up to this lesson. Kansas-Nebraska Act, first off. This is the law that established that in the territories, instead of the Missouri Compromise, where anything above the 3630 would be free and anything below the 3630 would be slave, we see popular sovereignty. This idea that the people of those territories should be the one to determine whether they're free or slave. Very democratic, makes a lot of sense, at least during that time. However, it's upsetting the compromise, the Missouri Compromise, which is going to cause some issues politically between the abolitionists and the pro-slavery individuals. Bleeding Kansas. Almost immediately after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Kansas is starting to apply for statehood. As they apply for statehood, the issue of popular sovereignty makes its way into the newspapers in Kansas. Both abolitionists from the North and pro-slavery Southerners come into Kansas to try to sway the votes one way or the other to push their own agenda. Unfortunately for many people, this starts to grow violent, especially with a fellow named John Brown that we talked about. Yes, this very Messiah-looking individual in the painting here, tearing the country apart before the American Civil War in that painting. He's going to go ahead and axe murder some people in Kansas, and this issue is going to push forth some of the ideas that the Northerners and Southerners aren't getting along, they can't trust each other, and a peaceful compromise is very much less than likely. Moving right along to the election of 1860. So let me go ahead and label these for you. So if that's 1, Bleeding Kansas, 2, election of 1860. This was the election where Abraham Lincoln is going to become the 16th president. Couple notable features from this election that we talked about before. This is a stark contrast between North and South. This is an excellent example of sectionalism. If you look at the political map of this election, the northern states go one way, the southern states go another way, the border states are somewhere in the middle for the most part. And because of the North's population from urbanization, industrialization, and in large parts immigration, especially of Irish immigrants coming over after the Irish potato famine, the population of the North gives them enough electoral votes to pretty much do whatever they want. And even with the whole South voting in one direction, it's not enough to keep the North from electing who they want to take over, who is Abraham Lincoln. And thinking back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln isn't on a crusade to end slavery immediately. He is more of an abolitionist, but he's not the extremist that we see later on with the ratification of the 13th Amendment towards the end of the Civil War. However, because of the loss of political power in the South, that they realize that they can't hold their own politically in the Electoral College or in the House of Representatives for that matter, which is also based on population, that's going to help motivate the South to secede before abolitionist laws can be forced through Congress and signed by an abolitionist president. Fort Sumter, this guy over here, this is the first notable engagement of the American Civil War. This was down in South Carolina, where the recently formed Confederate States of America are going to bombard Fort Sumter and force the garrison to surrender. This is going to prompt Abraham Lincoln to take more of a militant action against the Confederate States, as shots have literally been fired. First Battle of Manassas or Bull Run. In the South, we refer to it mostly as Manassas. In the North, they typically call it Bull Run. This was the first major engagement between the armies of the Confederate States of America and the armies of the United States of America. happened right down the road from Rappahannock over in Manassas. Some of our classes go to field trips there, so it's really just right around the corner. This was a significant engagement for a couple of reasons. First off, it's the first large-scale battle of the war, but also it's going to show that this war is not going to be over after one battle. People from DC and the surrounding areas, stories tell of them coming down with picnic baskets and having picnics in the hills overwatching the battlefield, hoping to see the boys in blue crush the dirty rebels and send them fleeing back to Richmond. And they're expecting more of a lighter affair. Now, the reality of the battle is far more chaotic, far more bloodshed than anyone was really expecting to see. And because of the determination of not just the South, but the North as well, it's going to convince a great many people that this is going to be a long war, this is going to be a bloody war, and this is going to be a terrible war. And it's really going to set the tone for the remainder of the conflict. All right. Looking at some of the political actions, let's talk about the Trent Affair. The Trent was a British ship that was transporting 2 Confederate diplomats from the South to England and France. Early on in the war, the Confederate States were hoping to recruit European nations to support them either financially, by loaning them money, materially, by giving them arms and gunpowder and ammunition, but also politically by recognizing the Confederate States of America as an independent nation, which would then allow them to enlist help from other countries and stand on their own. This is in stark contrast to what Abraham Lincoln and the United States government, which was saying, was that the Confederate States of America is not an independent nation. They're just a part of the country that's in open rebellion against the government of the United States. So 2 different political explanations for what's going on taking place. While the Trent was en route to Europe, it's going to be intercepted by an American warship, who the commander of which is going to board the ship, find the Confederate diplomats, arrest them, and take them back to the United States. Great Britain is going to throw a pretty reasonable fit because they're neutral in the war. And if a United States vessel is going to board and practically kidnap people from the British ship, that's pretty aggressive. And as a neutral country, Great Britain feels that they should be able to use their ships to trade or go where they want or to share information, especially considering this is out in open water. Now, if the British ship was cruising off the coast of Georgia, for example, and it was intercepted by U.S. warships, well, that's a war zone, and that British ship probably shouldn't have been there. But being out in international waters, out in the middle of the Atlantic, less justifiable for the U.S. ship to go ahead and board the British ship. The British are going to threaten war for this breach of neutrality. They're going to send thousands of troops to Canada in preparation for a potential war. Neither the United States or Great Britain want this war. And luckily, Lincoln humbles himself in the government. They free the prisoners. They apologize. Lincoln claims that the commander was acting without anyone's other orders, that the commander was solely responsible. So they kind of push him under the bus, or under the boat in this case. And peace is going to be maintained. Emancipation Proclamation. This is going to happen the first day of the new year in 1863. This was a document and a declaration from Abraham Lincoln, the United States government, saying that all slaves in Confederate-held territory or states in open rebellion were hereby freed. For the individuals in the U.S. government and in the North that didn't really support equality between the races, they're going to be convinced that this is largely a war measure. And the way it's phrased and the way it's utilized is very much a war measure. Abraham Lincoln and the War Department, what they'd like to do is they would like to see the slaves in the South either rebel against the Confederate States or just leave. Much of the Southern strategy is reliant on the slave labor of the South, of the African Americans, to work the field, to continue to produce food and goods for the war effort, to free up the free white men to go and fight in the battles. If the slave labor is taken away from them or it runs away, the Southern Army has to send soldiers home to continue the work that the slaves left behind, therefore weakening the Confederate military, making it easier for the Northerners to win. So that's the way they kind of justify it as a war measure. The way it's phrased is significant. It's very particular. It emphasizes that this only applies to states in open rebellion against the United States government. So the border states, the ones in red in the map over here, so all these red states, those were pro-slavery states that remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War. Because they're not in open rebellion, they get to go ahead and keep their slaves and keep on keeping on the way they were before war broke out. And so Lincoln is very deliberately trying to keep the pro-slavery border states loyal to the Union with the phrasing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you can see, this is extremely significant for Lincoln, very close to home, if I can circle it, because Maryland itself is a pretty pro-slavery border state. And if Maryland decides to join the Confederacy, well, DC, which is located between Maryland and Virginia, is cut off from the rest of the Union, creating a whole new list of problems for the federal government. So keeping Maryland friendly to the United States government is pretty important for Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet. The Emancipation Proclamation was practically useless. It was very much a symbolic gesture. It was practically useless because the Confederacy still holds the South, and this only applies to the territory held by the Confederacy. A modern example would be like if Canada tried to pass some law to regulate Americans in the United States of America. Why would we listen to that? That's the Canadian government. We're not going to do what the Canadians want. We're going to do what our government says. And so it's mostly going to be ignored. However, symbolically, that's where the blow is going to land. It's very symbolically important. It gave the United States government the moral high ground in the war, and it starts to shift the war from being a war about preserving the Union, which it still is, but it's also adding the moral element of freeing the slaves. So now this has become more of a moral crusade against slavery, in addition to preserving the Union and keeping the United States of America united. Some of the long-term consequences of this, because the United States government just made it abundantly clear that they're fighting, at least in part, against the institution of slavery itself, that communicates to the Confederate government that if the Confederacy loses this war, slavery is not going to be around, at least in any form that it was before the Civil War. So in effect, this is going to establish that this is going to be a war to the end over the institution of slavery. This is also going to tie the hands of countries like Britain and France, where with the Trent Affair, we saw Confederate diplomats trying to go to Europe to get London and Paris to recognize the Confederate States of America and support them. But when Abraham Lincoln and the cabinet issued the Emancipation Proclamation, this makes it a war about slavery. And both Britain and France, who have already outlawed slavery in the decades before the American Civil War, for them to look at this now and go, oh, this is a war about slavery, it's extremely unlikely that those governments that have already got rid of slavery in their own countries, it's extremely unlikely that they would support a pro-slavery South when the issue is morally about slavery. So this is one of those good chess moves of Abraham Lincoln to force the European countries to not get involved in the American Civil War, at least on the side of the Confederate States, and to keep them out of it. Habeas corpus comes from the Latin for produce the body. I think it's Latin. Don't ask Mr. Sharp, the Latin teacher. He'll probably tell me I'm wrong. But habeas corpus produced the body. This is something that is so constitutional rights in the Bill of Rights, that you cannot be imprisoned without seeing a judge or a jury or someone to make sure that the imprisonment is legal and justified. Lincoln, during the American Civil War, is going to suspend the writ or the right of habeas corpus so that he can effectively, he and other government officials can imprison people on suspicion of supporting the Confederacy without going to a judge, without going to a jury, and without due process of law. Lincoln justifies this as a war measure because he needs to keep the peace during a national emergency. He's not going to be the only president to do something like this. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his administration during World War II is going to do similar things. For them, we're going to talk about the Japanese concentration camps in the United States of America during World War II, but we'll get to that at a later unit. But just to make sure we're on the same page, Lincoln's not the only one to ever do this. Many people during the time are going to start to call Abraham Lincoln a tyrant, if they haven't already called him a tyrant after recruiting soldiers to forcibly bring the Confederate States back. Now they're definitely calling him a tyrant. They're claiming that Lincoln is attacking the constitutional rights of America to take advantage for his own gains. And it's going to cause some issues for Abraham Lincoln's popularity, at least during the time. So when we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, this is a great example. When we look at historical figures, especially in a general history class like this one, it's really easy to summarize people as good and bad. However, in reality, people are very complex, just like you or I, and there are good things that they'll do, and there are not so good things that they'll do. And this is one of the examples of Abraham Lincoln maybe towing the line of being kind of a villain. But we'll see how that works out in the grand scheme of things. And if nothing else, the legacy of Abraham Lincoln emphasizes the good things. So we kind of see where he landed on the side of history there. For context, over 13,000 suspected, so not even proven or justifiable, Confederate sympathizers are going to be arrested. Many of them are released pretty quickly. But the fact that they're arrested and held for any period of time without a warrant, without a judge order, without cause is kind of a shady deal for the United States of America during this time. But again, people do crazy things during crazy times, and the fear that existed in this historical context kind of makes sense. Conscription. Both sides during the American Civil War are going to draft or conscript their citizens to fight in the war. We've seen this here in the United States pretty frequently during times of conflict. We see this during the American Civil War. We'll see it during World War I. We'll see this during World War II. We'll see this during Korea. We'll see this during Vietnam. And after Vietnam, we mostly get rid of the draft. It still exists, the Selective Service Act, but there hasn't been a draft since Vietnam. Both sides are going to start conscripting people. If you look at the years and when they start, keep in mind, Lincoln was sworn in 1861, and that's when the first battles are being fought. So the Confederate States, a year later, have gone through their volunteers, people that volunteered or freely chose to join the war effort, and they're starting to conscript people. For the Confederate States, they're conscripting people from 18 to 35, so a pretty big window. By 1864, as the war is nearing its end, they're so desperate for manpower that they're going to expand that to 17 to 50 years old. For the South, for the Confederates, planters who owned 20 or more slaves were often exempt from the draft, and that was explained because they needed to be at home to oversee the slaves on the plantation, and that their best service to the Confederates were at home. That is going to play pretty poorly with a lot of the poor Southern whites who are fighting in the war, who don't own any slaves or maybe one or two, and they cannot get an exemption from the draft. And so they start to see this as poor men fighting a rich man's war, while the rich guys who own 20 or more slaves are at home hanging out, dodging the war in its entirety. For the North, they're drafting individuals aged 20 to 45 with such a large population, or at least larger than the Confederate States of America, the draft doesn't have to be expanded to the same extent because they're able to get more people, even with that smaller age group, by the end of the war to win the war. The North is also going to be helped out a lot after the Emancipation Proclamation with, I'm totally blanking on the number, but I want to say it's close to 100,000 African Americans or free slaves or runaway slaves that join the army to fight in the war effort. There's going to be a couple regiments. I think it's the 54th Massachusetts. The movie Glory is based around them. They're an entire regiment made up of black soldiers with white officers who are going to fight for the Union. They're not the only one. There was another one out west that was captured in a fort, and they're pretty much going to be executed and re-enslaved by the Confederates who capture them. That's a really dark tale of the American Civil War, but we're not going to go too much into that. It's worth looking into if you're curious, but we don't really have time in class for that. Both sides are going to allow substitutes to be hired. I can't remember the exact amount off the top of my head, but roughly it comes out to a year's salary. And so whether you're a poor Southerner or a poor Northerner, that's a lot of money. And this is another example of how if you're some rich guy's kid or you yourself have money, you can buy your way out of the draft so that you don't have to risk your life fighting in the war, where the poor instead are being sent to fight and kill and die and be maimed, while the rich guys just hang out at home watching the war through the newspapers. The draft on both sides is despised. No one likes being forced to do anything that you don't want to do. You're all high school students, so I'm sure you're familiar with this every day. But especially when it comes to the nastiness of war. People are not liking this. There's going to be draft riots that we'll see on the next slide during the Civil War, and we'll see some pretty intense draft riots in the United States during the Vietnam War when we get to that point as well. So this isn't a unique thing for the American Civil War. All right, promise you some riots. Here are your riots. Summer of 1863, there are going to be riots across the North in a couple of the major cities. I think St. Louis, Chicago, and New York. New York being the largest of those, are the ones that gets the most attention. As I mentioned on the previous slide, poor whites often opposed the draft because they couldn't buy their way out of the draft like the rich guys could. They didn't want to risk dying to free the slaves, because this is after the Emancipation Proclamation. And so many of them see this as a war to free the slaves. And one of the concerns for poor whites, especially in the North, is that if the slaves are freed, they're going to come north and start to take those low-paying jobs, those basic level jobs that the Irish and the German immigrants, as well as other poor whites, rely on. And nobody really wants competition for their jobs. So it makes sense within the context on why poor whites would be so opposed to slaves coming north and taking their jobs. In New York, the rioters are going to attack wealthy whites who they see as buying their way out of the war. Again, poor men don't want to die for a rich man's war. But they're also going to attack African Americans largely because of the symbol that they are, as many people see this continuing war as a war over slavery. And so if you're a free black, hey, I'm going to associate you with why my son or brother is down being wounded or killed at Antietam or Gettysburg or Fredericksburg. There's also a lot of systematic racism during this time. Even white Northerners were pretty grossly racist, at least for modern context. If we're looking at it from 2020, there's a lot of nastiness out there, but back then that was more of the normal. It's not saying it's a good thing, but looking at it from today's standpoint, it really gets sticky and gross pretty quickly. During the riots, over 100 individuals are going to be killed. The U.S. Army is going to be sent, or at least units of the U.S. Army are going to be sent in to forcibly end the riots. Considering this is happening in July of 1863, some of these are the same men that just fought for 3 days at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, defeating the Confederate States there. And now they're marching back to New York City to put down a riot of other Northerners. Some estimates go as high as 1,000 deaths. We don't really know for sure. There was a lot of buildings lit on fire and people going missing. And so it's possible that the number is higher, but we don't really know for sure at this time. So somewhere between 100 and 1,000. And if you're taking the good historian stance, take your low estimate, take your high estimate. It's probably somewhere in the middle because people like to exaggerate or get their facts wrong. So you have to find that happy medium. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, it's a pretty fantastic movie in its own right, but the last act of the movie, last couple scenes take place during the draft riots in New York City. And so you get to see a lot of that discontentment. You get to see a lot of the racism and hatred and pent up bitterness of the poor whites against the rich whites and the poor whites against African Americans that they viewed this war being about. And in the end of the movie, the U.S. Army comes in and starts to clean up the riot and the protest, the violent protests. All righty. So that's all I have for you guys today. If you guys have any questions, be sure to let me know. And I will make myself available if you shoot me an email or wave at me frantically in class. So until next time, Mr. Long, over and out.